Hi everyone, my name is Paul Hawkins. I work for a charity called Attitudes is Everything, and we work to improve access to live music for disabled people. It's great to see you all here. I am a middle-aged man, really, aren't I? I'm a middle-aged man with with some stubble, probably need a shave. My hair, you can't quite see it at the moment because my camera's tinted, probably need to comb through it as well. I'm wearing a bright orange t-shirt and I'm sat in a room with a door just behind me and a wardrobe just to my right. I am going to be talking to you very quickly today about disability equality and looking as well at language and terminology. So there'll be space for questions at the end, but I also have no problem with people asking questions as we go. Save to say that once I start sharing my screen, I may not see questions coming in, but Phoebe has kindly offered to keep an eye out for questions and let me know if there are any. So if you're not sure about anything or want to know more about anything, please do ask. I'm going to share my screen, but I'm on one screen at the moment, so I'm going to need to share my screen, then share the presentation. So this won't look quite as slick as I'd like it to, but then nothing I do ever looks as slick as I'd like it to. So I can cope with that. So yeah, so as I say, this is an Empower Hour on accessibility, which presumably you know what you signed up for. And I'm going to start by going through some stats just to explain about the background of disability in the UK and sort of background about what we're doing and why we're talking about it. So there's 14.6 million disabled people in the UK, and that includes 21% of working age adults. So when I say there's 14.6 million disabled people in the UK, I should explain that that's people who could be considered disabled under the Equality Act. Now, not all those people will necessarily think themselves as being disabled. Some people with long-term health conditions, some people who are neurodivergent, some people who are deaf, don't necessarily think about themselves as being disabled, people with mental health conditions as well. But these are all people who've got legal rights under the Equality Act in the UK, which protect them from discrimination. And whether or not you choose to identify as disabled doesn't change whether you've got those rights. But we use disabled as shorthand for everyone who's got those rights under the Equality Act. 38% of deaf and disabled artists are unable to access their nearest rehearsal space. I just want to give a bit of a picture of the where we are with inequality in the music industry, and the fact that for a lot of deaf and disabled artists, even rehearsing is something which is a barrier due to accessing spaces. 70% of deaf and disabled artists have withheld details of a health condition from a promoted venue or festival. So there's a real issue around disclosure there, and that's this is something really important. It's that often people aren't necessarily comfortable talking about the fact they've got impairments due to the fear that maybe that will mean that they're not offered opportunities, maybe that maybe things won't happen. I should say that these stats I'm using at the moment come from our Next Stage survey, which is a survey we did of artists in 2019. 67% of those deaf and disabled artists have had to compromise their well-being to perform live. And I think this is a really important stat, that we know that there's situations where disabled people are putting themselves at risk within the music industry because the idea of being uncomfortable, being unsafe, still nonetheless feels safer than the risk of disclosure and facing discrimination. And I should say around this that my job, I'm being slightly unstructured here. I should have said that I'm the head of volunteering and skills development at Attitudes is Everything, and I work to get more disabled people working in the music industry. And I talk to a lot of organisations, I talk to a lot of employers, and I honestly think the music industry is actually, in many ways, more open to recruiting disabled people and more open to challenging barriers than a lot of other industries. But I think the problem is that because nonetheless, despite that, negative attitudes exist, and there are experiences where artists have faced discrimination, where people working in the industry have faced discrimination. I think that nonetheless means that even if 90% of the organisations are great and are going to do the right thing, it's very difficult to know that you're talking to one of those 90% of great organisations and to feel safe doing that. So there's a real issue of the perception disabled people have of from the fact that discrimination exists, how can you be sure that you're not going to be discriminated against in any particular setting? Also got a stat here. This is from Harbourside Music, who do work around Ben Price, who runs Harbourside Music, is a disabled artist manager. He did some research funded by the lottery last year into the barriers disabled people face in the industry. And he found that 69% of disabled employees who are not disclosing their impairments, so those who are not talking about the fact they're disabled, have said they're putting their own health and safety at risk as a result. So as you'll see, you've got 67% for artists, 69% from employees, and these are from two different surveys 3 years apart, but remarkably similar numbers, which suggests that this might be a prevalent and ongoing problem. 51% of disabled employees in the music industry, and I should say here, I've said disabled employees, this actually includes people who are applying for jobs in the industry but haven't successfully managed to get a job in the industry. But 51% of disabled employees in the industry have withdrawn from a job application process due to a lack of accessibility. And this is really important because I don't know how many of you are recruiters, and I don't know how many of you who are recruiters do any kind of monitoring of who's applying for your jobs. But one of the problems is that when you monitor who applies for your jobs, what you can't monitor in the same way is who starts to apply for your jobs, but then withdraws from the process partway through because they can't find the information that reassures them about your organization's accessibility, or the application form isn't accessible, or other barriers come up along the way. So maybe even your website isn't accessible, so someone can't download the application. But essentially, you never quite know who's not applied for a job but sort of tried to and started to do so. And I think that's a really important thing when you're collecting stats, is to think about the kind of what in audience terms, it's called the invisible audience, but the people who you don't know that you're not reaching and you can't see that you're not reaching. And then 79% of disabled employees in the music industry believe that barriers related to access have impacted on their career. So this came from a survey that we did of disabled people working in the music industry, and we found that 79% of the people we spoke to felt that their career had been impacted by barriers relating to access. So this is something where, you know, disabled people feel that their impairment's holding them back. Now, I should say with this that there was a follow-up question that we actually didn't ask, but I'd like to ask now, which is what those barriers are, in the sense that you know, sometimes it might be that an employer is discriminating against someone. Sometimes it might be what's called internalized oppression. And what that means is that disabled people's conceptions of themselves and their own abilities have been impacted by the discrimination that they've experienced, to a point where their careers being held back because they won't apply for opportunities because they believe they may face discrimination. They believe that, for example, a huge thing in the music industry is the fact that there's an expectation that everyone works very long hours. And obviously, if you've got a fluctuating impairment where you can't always work those very long hours, that can potentially mean that you might then see a job which sort of makes very clear that you're going to be kind of working excessive additional hours on top of your paid hours, and then you might think, well, actually I can't apply for that role because it won't be accessible for me. And then directly tying into that, 73% of and this is going back to the Harbourside Management Survey, 73% of people felt that extended work hours and a lack of flexibility were a barrier to disabled people engaging in the music industry. And this is a huge thing, you know, that you know, it's not just about sort of physical access. It's about policies and processes. It's also about the expectations we put on the people we work with. And I think that's a really huge and really, really important thing. So within this session, so we've only got an hour. So we do, as an organisation, run 3-hour disability equality training sessions, which by their very nature would take 3 hours. And what I'm doing here is taking bits out of this. So I've talked about some stats. I'm now going to talk about some of the models of disability that we think about and how we think about accessibility as an organisation and why. And then afterwards, I'm going to talk a bit about language and kind of what language might be appropriate, what language might not be appropriate, and the reasons for that, and what appropriate or inappropriate actually means in practice. So when we talk about models of disability, these are different ways that people perceive disability, and everyone will perceive disability in a particular way, even if not everyone knows they're doing that. And historically, a lot of people have thought about what's called, sorry, my screen's not jumping forward, there we go, what's called the medical model of disability. So the medical model of disability is probably the historic way people have often thought about disability, and it's about cure, it's about welfare, it's about care, and it's basically about the idea that disability is a problem, and the solution to that problem is to cure or fix disability. So let's say that hypothetically, you're running an event. It's a gig. The gig is an upstairs venue, and you've got a wheelchair user who wants to attend, but there's only steps into the venue. Now, the medical model solution to that would be to say, well, that disabled person has got a problem. They're a wheelchair user, so of course they can't get upstairs. So therefore, if they want to go to that gig, then they need to stop being a wheelchair user. So that means maybe they need sort of 6 months of intensive physiotherapy, and maybe after 6 months of intensive physiotherapy, maybe they can climb that flight of stairs, and maybe then they can go to the gig. But in reality, that gig would probably have happened. But and this might sound a little bit kind of flippant or unrealistic example, but essentially I think there is a expectation around much of society that if someone's disabled, it's a shame they can't do things, but they can't get to those things, and that's the end of it. And how that's often worked out in practice historically, until quite recently, until the 1980s, was that disabled people, whether we're talking about people with physical impairments, mental health conditions, neurodivergent people, people with learning difficulties, very often were moved into institutions at a young age, then would spend their entire lives living in institutions. And it was only in the 1980s and 1990s that those institutions closed and disabled people were allowed to move back into society. And when that happened, it's worth saying, and this is only 30 years ago, which doesn't feel a long time. It might feel 30 years ago, might feel a longer time to some people on this call, but doesn't feel a long time away to me. It was only in the early 90s that disabled people were coming out of long-term institutions into living settings. And very often there'd be the same newspapers that don't much like asylum seekers or immigrants now would be sort of saying, well, we've got these disabled people moving to our community, we've got the people with mental health conditions, we've got these new, well, they wouldn't have said neurodivergent, they would have used various other derogatory terms, but neurodivergent people with learning difficulty moving, and and then these newspapers were saying, well, this is going to affect the property prices, this is going to increase crime rates. And 30 years ago, the idea that disabled people living independently wasn't safe for them or safe for society was a mainstream view. And I think it's really important to say that the idea that disabled people can't participate in mainstream society because they're disabled is quite a was a prevalent view. And I think we saw it again during COVID. We saw this idea in some of the newspapers that actually, the whole kind of lockdown to go away. We just kind of locked up the disabled and vulnerable people for a while. Then everyone else could go about their lives, and potentially we're talking about 1 in 5 of the population that would therefore be locked up. But this idea that kind of it's a medical problem's quite prevalent. Then slightly moving on from the medical model, you've got what's called the tragedy model of disability. So the tragedy model is the idea that disability is a tragedy and disabled people are suffering with their conditions, and it sort of says that disabled people are inadequate, they're expensive, they're needy, they're draining everyone's resources. And what this then leads to is charities, and it leads to this approach you'll see if you sit at home and watch daytime television. You will see these adverts that say, this is Timmy. Timmy's losing his eyesight. Imagine a world of darkness. Imagine living without sight. Give us some money now and we can help Timmy and we can save Timmy from a world of darkness. And if you're a person with a visual impairment who's watching those adverts, you're basically being told your life isn't of value, and the fact that you're living with an impairment is a tragedy, which is awful, and no one should wish on themselves. And it's obviously quite a depressing, quite negative message that says disabled people don't have value in society. And there's a flip side to this, in that you then also, what you can then get is this other side of it, which is where people talk about when disabled people do things. They talk about how brave they are and how courageous and heroic they are. My favourite thing is when people talk about how, despite their disability, people compete in the Paralympic Games. I mean, with the Paralympic Games, being disabled is literally the qualifying criteria, and there's still this idea that kind of, you know, people are succeeding despite their disability. And I remember when the Olympics were in London in 2012, my grandmother saying to me, you know, well, it's you know, I shouldn't complain about my life. Those Paralympic athletes, look what they're doing. They've got it so much worse than me. And, you know, at this point, obviously, these Paralympic athletes were traveling the world competing in professional sport. Whereas my grandmother at that point was not young. She wasn't going out much. She wasn't leaving the house much. I mean, she had impairments of her own, but she was, you know, she was at home, not managing to do much, and still feeding that kind of international athletes are actually worse off than her because they're disabled, because we've got this whole idea that being disabled is a bad thing from the tragedy model. And then you see this in newspapers, you see this tabloid view of disability. Well, on the one hand, you've either got the scroungers, you've got the disabled people who are taking, you know, your tax money to pay for their benefits, and they're probably faking it anyway. Or you've got these superhumans who are amazing because they're disabled, but they've competed on Britain's Got Talent, you know, and it's this really kind of you know, kind of negative view of disability. So again, we don't tend to think about disability in this way. We tend to think about disability in terms of what is called the social model of disability. So the social model is a bit different in that it was developed by and for disabled people. So the social model developed in the early 1980s. It was developed by some of the people who were living in these long-term institutions. And it was the idea that actually the problem of inaccessibility is not the disabled people. It's not that disabled people have a problem. It's that society is organised in a way that creates discrimination and inaccessibility. So if we go back to our event in an upstairs room, the reason why a wheelchair user can't access it isn't because wheelchair users using a wheelchair. It's because when that venue was built, someone took a decision to build a flight of stairs and not a ramp and not a lift. And ultimately, it's easy to say that you know, buildings are historic, and obviously there are protected buildings that are hard to do things to. But any building, no matter how historic, design decisions are made, and obviously those design decisions are influenced by the technology of the time, by the attitudes of the time. But you know, it's not the kind of inaccessible buildings ever magically happen. Whenever anything is inaccessible, it's inaccessible because someone has made a decision where they've not thought about who's using the space and thought about disabled people. And the idea of the social model is that actually, if we built everything in an accessible way, then how would people be disabled? Because there's nothing disabling people. So it changes the focus away from people's impairments and focuses on removing barriers that disable people. And quite simply, the social model is this idea that people may have impairments, people may have long-term health conditions, but they're disabled by barriers in society. So speaking personally, I've got a range of impairments, one of which is a continence impairment. And if I'm going to a gig, I need a toilet which has got hot water. I need a toilet that's got soap. I need a toilet that's got toilet paper. Need a toilet that's got a toilet seat attached to it. You know, sometimes I need an accessible toilet when things aren't so great. But ultimately, if all those things are in place, then nothing disabling me, and I'm not disabled in that space. But when I go to a music festival where I need kind of hot running water to a kind of complex medical procedure for an hour every day, I'm suddenly often disabled in that space because the ability to do what I need to do isn't there. And it's sort of, and this whole idea of the social model is actually what disables you changes in a moment of time. It's not your health, though your health may fluctuate. It's that disability is the experience of barriers, and experiencing barriers is what disables you. And those barriers can look like different things. So often we think about environmental barriers. So environmental barriers are physical features such as whether there's steps, whether there's an accessible toilet, whether there's whether there's a ramped entrance, whether there's a viewing platform, a viewing area, whether you've got, whether the counters have got lowered access to them. All these different questions are all environmental barriers. Also, for some neurodivergent people, those environmental barriers might be about the amount of light in a room, the amount of noise in a room. So all these different things are environmental, and they're fixable, but there can be quite long-term fixes, and there can be quite expensive fixes, but they are fixable. But you've then got organizational barriers. Organizational barriers are created by society and organizations when they make decisions or create policies, ignore or forget the needs of disabled people. And often disabled people are often not represented in workplaces, often not represented in local councils, often not represented in the kind of halls of government. So often when policies are made, when decisions are made, when senior management teams, which often don't include disabled people, make decisions, the lack of a disabled person in the room often means that organizational barriers happen because people just haven't thought, how might a disabled person access this? What would the impact of this thing be? And very often that means you then end up with policies where, to give a recent example, you've got a space that doesn't allow people to take food into that space, but you've got people taking essential medication who need to eat with that medication. And if you've created that policy and you're not flexible around that policy, because you just say, well, actually no one can bring food in, and that's the end of it, potentially you're then discriminating against people who need to bring that food in. And it's an organizational barrier because people have put that policy in and no one's thought, well, actually what impact would that have? And over a quarter of disabled people say that they frequently lack choice and control over their daily lives, and that's quite an old stat. Annoyingly, we don't have a newer one that gets a similar thing, but we think it's an important stat, so we keep using it. There's also barriers of perception and representation. So that this is the way that disabled people are perceived and represented in the media and society. So this is firstly that often disabled people are underrepresented in the media. Also, you often will get non-disabled people representing disabled people. So you'll get, for example, and that can mean different things. That can mean non-disabled actors playing disabled parts. I think the most interesting one of these is, in some ways, is Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man. Now, Dustin Hoffman also obviously is not a autistic person, and he was playing a character who has widely defined most people's views of autism. However, as I say, Dustin Hoffman obviously was not autistic. The person who wrote it was not autistic. Rain Man was based on a real person, and it ultimately turned out that the real person also wasn't autistic either and been misdiagnosed. So it means that people's perception of autism from the 1980s still to today, a lot of perceptions people have come from a non-autistic actor playing a role written by a non-autistic writer, playing a character who actually wasn't actually autistic and being completely misdiagnosed. And it sort of shows how misrepresentation happens. But also often in the media, when people talk about disability, it'll be the CEOs of disability charities who aren't disabled. It'll be often the brother of a disabled person or the mother of a disabled person, or the daughter of a disabled person. And very often disabled people's voices themselves aren't heard. There's also the way that as a society, we equate physical imperfection with moral imperfection. So from a young age, we grew up with fairy tales. And if you read any of the grim fairy tales, you can tell who the villains are, because the villains will always have some kind of physical imperfection. So let's take, for example, Cinderella. You've got the ugly stepsisters, and we don't know what ugly means, but we know that's people who obviously look different to the kind of social norm, the stepsisters, and they're villains because they're obviously not they're not beautiful and pure like Cinderella. And then at the end of Cinderella, the stepsisters are punished and they get their eyes pecked out by birds due to their wickedness. So it's sort of the whole idea is that disability is a punishment because they're evil people. They're therefore being punished with disability. You also get inspiration porn, which is a term coined by Stella Young, a disabled activist who's now sadly passed away, and it was coined in around 2010. And it's the way you get, for example, Oscar-winning films that kind of tell heartwarming stories about disability so that non-disabled people can feel good about themselves. You also get this thing where disabled people are used as a moral lesson for other characters. So I think this is the case in the recent film Music, which I didn't actually see. But again, going back to Rain Man, you've got this film where essentially Tom Cruise is a arsehole. I mean, that's in the film, and you know, even possibly in real life as well. But Tom Cruise is an arsehole and selfish. And by being around his brother, played by Dustin Hoffman, he becomes a better person. And the whole point of the disabled character played by Dustin Hoffman, he's not meant to be a kind of, you know, he has no desires of his own. He has no real goals of his own. He's basically there to make Tom Cruise a better person. And maybe it's worth making Tom Cruise a better person, but it's no, he denies disabled people agency in their own lives, and often in the media that happens. And then you also get disabled people being treated differently due to race or gender. And so often, in neurodivergent people with mental health conditions, the exact same behaviors will be interpreted very differently depending on whether it's a white person doing it or whether it's a black person doing it. And, you know, in America, one of the things that's missed within all the horrific shootings, the police shootings there, is that 50% of the people shot by the police, often African-American people shot by the police, are disabled as well as being black. And, you know, and often that comes down to the fact that someone might have a mental health condition, might be neurodivergent, might be deaf and just not hear the instruction to put their hands up. All these different reasons why disabled people, you know, will be treated as a threat if they're of a different race or gender. And then also as well, you know, perceptions of what people can achieve, how disability is seen, you know, race and gender has a huge impact on it. And it all ties back to perception and representation. And then the last barrier I'm going to talk about is attitudinal barriers. So this is the way disabled people are perceived and treated. So this could be from a lack of education or lack of confidence. People might be rude, might be over attentive, might avoid disabled people entirely. And nearly 2/3 of people, again, an old stat, but we can't get a good new stat that captures this, but nearly 2/3 of people have admitted they avoid disabled people because they don't know how to act around them. And something we do know is that young disabled people experience loneliness at a much higher rate than non-disabled people. And a huge part of that, we think, is because people avoid disabled people because they're not sure what to say to them. And often when I'm talking about this, I say the fact that attitudinal barriers are so important is why our organisation is called Attitude is Everything. I once said that with our CEO in the room and found out that it isn't why we're called Attitude is Everything. But I think it makes the point really well. So I still tell people it's why we're called Attitude is Everything. So that's an overview of the social model of disability. I'm going relatively quickly because I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for questions. But I'm going to talk about language and some different uses of language. So with language and terminology, it's worth saying, you know, state the obvious, not all disabled people hold the same views on language and terminology. I'm going to talk quite generally here, but I want to be very clear. People have got their own individual views. You know, it's always best to avoid thinking, oh, disabled people like this term or disabled people don't like this term, because it's much more nuanced and much more complex than that. And also it's worth saying, obviously, it depends on relationships. So you will get some disabled people may refer to themselves in quite a kind of mocking way, may also have friends who do that, but then feel completely different if a complete stranger does it for obvious reasons. So with language and terminology, it's always going to be a bit of a guide. But I want to talk about some key areas and some of the thought around the language that you use. Starting off with disability itself. So with disability, I've got these 5 different terms I want to talk about. So as we talked about already, disability, we talk about at least as when someone's experiencing a barrier. So we don't think of a disability as being something people have. We think it's something that people experience, whereas an impairment is how we describe the condition that people have or a health condition. Disabled people and people with disabilities. So if you believe in a social model of disability, then you might very well feel that people don't have disabilities. So people with disabilities can be a term which people who strongly believe in social model disability are not keen on, because it puts the onus and responsibility for the disability on the person, whereas actually we should be saying that society is disabling people. So therefore, a lot of people from social model disability organisations tend to talk about disabled people rather than people with disabilities. And I tend to talk about myself as a disabled person. And that's to say that I experience barriers in society, society disables me, therefore I am a disabled person. Not everyone feels that, and lots of disabled people in the UK are not from activist backgrounds. So you will often find people who do use the term people with disabilities. And I'd never tell people not to use it for that reason, because some people may prefer it. But it's worth knowing there is a political choice in whether you say people with disabilities or disabled people. If you say disabled people, you're saying people are disabled by society. If you say people with disabilities, then you're being people first, and you're saying, these are, I'm thinking about you as a person first, but you're also saying you have the disability, not society. Then the term accessible can be quite helpful in terms of how to describe parking spaces, how to describe toilets, how to describe camping areas, festivals, in the sense that, not all, as I talked about at the top of this, not all disabled people think about themselves as being disabled. So using the word accessible can be a bit more open and say, this is for someone who needs a space that meets their access requirements. I'm not putting a label on you. I'm saying this is our accessible toilet, this is our accessible parking space. So if that's what you need, then you can use it. So that's where accessible comes in. Also want to talk about deaf culture. So a lot of deaf people do not recognize the term disabled or the term impairment as being part of their experience. And this comes down to what's called deaf culture. So basically, a lot of people who are born deaf, who acquire deafness at an early age, and who are first language BSL users. So BSL is British Sign Language. So first language British Sign Language users would often think of themselves as a cultural group, part of a wider deaf culture, who use British Sign Language as a first language. And it's worth saying British Sign Language is a language in its own right. It's not English with signs. It's, if a British Sign Language user is using English, they're using a second language, and it's important to not assume they'll be proficient in that. But yeah, a BSL user will feel themselves to be part of a wider deaf culture, which should be celebrated, rather than saying, deaf people need to be supported to integrate into the rest of society. A lot of deaf people take the view, we've got a culture, we've got a way of communicating, and we should celebrate and protect that, much in the same way that you get kind of people celebrating Welsh culture and people and the Welsh language. And there's this concept of deafhood, which is the deaf, a kind of wider term for the deaf experience. And it's worth saying with that people who are not part of this wider deaf culture will often use the term hearing impairment or hard of hearing. And often younger people who use hearing impairment, older people use hard of hearing. But it's worth saying it's important to distinguish deaf or hearing impairment, deaf or hard of hearing, because again, both the terms hearing impairment and hard of hearing may not reflect a deaf person's experience of themselves as a British Sign Language user who doesn't feel there's anything wrong with the fact that they don't use kind of heard language. Then you get to neurodiversity. So with neurodiversity, this is a term that's relatively recent. It was coined in the late 1990s by Judy Singer, who was an academic who identified as autistic herself. And it was historically, neurodiversity was first used to describe autistic people's experiences, but it's become a wider term to describe people with a whole range of conditions, from autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, Tourette syndrome, a whole potentially mental health conditions, potentially learning difficulties. And it's worth saying that it's it's now become a wider term. And again, it's saying the key point of neurodiversity is the idea that it's not about people having something wrong with them. It's about saying some people are neurotypical and think in a particular way. Some people are neurodiverse and think in different ways. And there's these two different words here, neurodivergent, neurodiverse, just because some neurodiverse people would point out that a person cannot be neurodiverse because diverse means a range of things. So a single person, you might describe as neurodivergent rather than neurodiverse. But neurodivergent, neurodiverse are words for people who are on the whole range of neurodiversity. And it's worth saying as well quickly about the spectrum. And obviously we think about spectrums mostly with autism, but also with ADHD, also with some other neurodivergent conditions. But when we talk about a spectrum, that's not saying some people are a bit autistic, some people are a lot autistic, and if you're autistic to a certain point, you're then diagnosed with autism. That's not what it is at all. All autistic behaviors, all ADHD behaviors are human behaviors that everyone experiences at one point or another. What the autistic spectrum or the ADHD spectrum mean is that they're conditions that affect people in different ways. So not every autistic person is the same. The saying goes that once you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And essentially, it's about saying, well, actually some autistic people might be very affected by the stimulation from light or from sound, but less so by crowds. It's about saying some people may have difficulties with motor function, which is kind of executive function, which is how to kind of plan out tasks, but then not be affected in terms of sensitivity to light and sound. It's saying that not all autistic people or people with ADHD are the same. And we've got this whole range of different conditions that's coming to neurodiversity, but often a lot of them kind of link in together and kind of share some similar features. And it's worth saying this is a whole quite new area of thinking about medicine, where it's worth not assuming that all labels that are attached to people are permanent and how everything would always be diagnosed and described. And one example of this is Asperger's. So Asperger's syndrome is now being phased out of diagnostic manuals, medical diagnostic manuals. So, there are people historically who've been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and that diagnosis is perfectly valid, but increasingly, people being diagnosed now would be diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder rather than Asperger's, because Asperger's is now being seen as a term that was brought in to describe some autistic behaviors, but actually is part of a wider picture of autism. So it's really important to think about the fact that diagnoses change, and also the fact that a diagnosis or a label can be helpful for one person, unhelpful for another. Not, it is worth not assuming that everyone needs a diagnosis. I also wanted to talk in linguistic terms about personal assistance. So different terms to describe the people who assist people at events or in the workplace. So we've got these 4 different terms. So the term carer tends to mean someone who provides intimate personal care to someone. It tends to be someone who provides personal care, medical care, and that's something which, might happen with someone who has assistance in events, but you probably don't need to know that someone's a carer, and it can be slightly over-personal to describe someone as a carer when that's not how someone thinks about them. So, for example, if you've got a young person who's going to an event and is bringing a date with them, but that date is giving them some assistance, describing that date as a carer might feel quite uncomfortable for the person. Similarly, a support worker tends to be a term used in professional settings only. So people might have support workers, but that's always going to be kind of paid support. If you're talking about people who assist disabled people in general, you're better off using personal assistant or companion. Probably companion if it's just going to an event, personal assistant if it's actually in a workplace and assisting with a task. These are much more neutral terms that have got a much wider frame of meaning, which means that it's much easier to talk about them generally without people feeling slightly uncomfortable describing people in a slightly inaccurate way. I want to talk a bit now about some inappropriate language. I will take questions quite soon. So inappropriate language comes from a range of different places. So often this can be medical terms that are now no longer in usage. So for example, mongoloid disorder was an early name for Down syndrome. And then there was a point where the word mongoloid or mong was used as an insult for disabled people, a derogatory term for disabled people. And that was but that was a medical term, which then being used in outdated ways. Similarly, cretinism has got an outdated, kind of medical history. Similarly, the term spastic originally comes from spastic cerebral palsy. So there's a range of medical terms no longer in use that then can sound quite inappropriate, and often can also become playground insults. So a lot of offensive terms for disabled people. I'm not going to start listing offensive terms for disabled people, but a lot of offensive terms for disabled people started off as medical terms and then became playground insults. And when they're playground insults, essentially it's people saying, people equating people they don't like with disabled people in a way that implies there's something negative about being disabled. But you then also get words that make assumptions. So sometimes people talk about people being wheelchair bound. And the problem with wheelchair bound is you're assuming that someone thinks that being in a wheelchair is a bad thing. And in reality, if you're unable to get from A to B, a wheelchair is really useful. So using the term wheelchair user doesn't have the implication you've got a view on someone using a wheelchair as a negative thing. Similarly, when you say you're so brave, you're sort of tell disabled people how brave they are. I got given a medal once, but anyway, that essentially, you're basically, it's quite patronizing to say you're brave for being disabled. If you're a disabled person who's rescued some kittens from a house fire, which is not what I got my medal for, then it's perfectly fine to kind of tell people they're being brave. If you're just giving someone a medal for being disabled, then or calling someone brave for being disabled, it's just quite patronizing and condescending. Then if you talk about a mental health problem or mental illness, you're immediately saying that someone's mental health is a problem. You're saying an illness, you're talking about someone's mental health negatively, whereas you could use the term mental health condition, which is much more neutral. Similarly, the term able-bodied, which is quite widely used. Headphones off me. That was not particularly professional. But the term able-bodied, which is quite widely used, that is a term which assumes that, what do we mean by an able body? Some bodies are more able than others at different tasks, and almost everyone's body is able to do some things, not able to do others. At one end of the spectrum, you get sort of, say, Usain Bolt, who can run 100 meters in kind of however many seconds. And none of our bodies, I'm not judging anyone on the call. Maybe there is someone on the call who can do 100 meters faster than Usain Bolt, but I'm suspecting most of our bodies are not able to do that in the same way. But I think, when we talk about able-bodied, we're sort of using a general term, which doesn't really sort of mean anything in some ways, because everyone's body's able in some ways. So yes, and non-disabled can be a better term to use. And then I wanted to use the term handicapped, which was widely used in the 80s, widely in the UK, and it's still used in the USA, across Europe. If you meet disabled people from around the world, they might use the term handicapped. And again, it's an interesting one because handicap comes from betting, and it comes from the idea of giving horses in a horse race or racers in a race a deliberate disadvantage to even up the race. So the problem with the term handicapped is you're basically assuming that disabled people have a disadvantage, which goes back to tragedy model language and goes back to thinking negatively about disabled people. So again, that's another example of where language can be inappropriate. And then the other area of inappropriate language I wanted to mention is when specific medical terms, which are perfectly valid medical terms, are used very casually. So for example, dwarfism is a real medical condition. It can cause someone to be shorter than the average stature, but there's around over 150 conditions that can cause someone to be shorter on average, of which one is dwarfism, which is why calling anyone who is shorter than average a dwarf, you're essentially using a very specific term in a casual way, which can be a bit offensive. Then also OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So people will often say they're a bit OCD if they like their towels ordered neatly, or they like to kind of make their bed every day. And obsessive compulsive disorder, you see the obsessive behaviors, but what's actually, or the compulsive behaviors even, but what's actually the major element of obsessive compulsive disorder is the obsessive thoughts. And the fact that someone who's got obsessive compulsive disorder, yes, you can see them sort of, kind of making things neat or shutting doors or whatever. What you don't see is the constant cycle of obsessive thoughts going on in someone's head, where they're absolutely convinced that terrible things are going to happen if they don't do that particular thing, or that they need to atone for something by doing something however many times. And when people start to use the term OCD for just kind of liking things to be neat and tidy. It just kind of trivializes the condition. And lastly, Tourette's syndrome is a very similar thing in that Tourette's syndrome is a condition which causes people to have involuntary spasms, involuntary movements. Sometimes those can be linguistic, like can be people making, kind of making sounds or saying words, but only 10% of people with Tourette's swear. That's not a big number of people with Tourette's actually involuntarily swear. I'm not going to say only 10% of people with Tourette's swear. I mean, I imagine, most people swear, don't they? But I mean, only 10% of people with Tourette's inadvertently swear as part of their tics. And, when people start saying, well, I think so-and-so's got Tourette's because they're swearing a lot, again, you're trivializing and misunderstanding a condition, which is a real condition, and kind of trivializing someone's experience. So these are different ways that language can be inappropriate. So that was a sort of bit of a kind of whistle-top tour through some of the things we talk about. But what I wanted to do, as I say, is give time for questions and answers. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and and open this up to anyone who wants to ask anything or just wants to hear a voice that isn't mine. Be brave, be brave.
You did cover so much. Maybe everyone's just completely got all the knowledge now.
Feel free to just type a question if you've got a question and don't want to actually say it out loud as well.
Can you hear me, Paul? I had a question.
I can. Yes, Abby. Yes,
Hello.
I can.
That was amazing, by the way. That was so interesting. I've learned so much, so thank you. I just had a question around some of the terminology you mentioned. There was something you said around around the social model and disabled people versus people with disabilities. Yeah. And I completely understand. I was interested in whether people might find, whether anyone finds disabled people offensive as opposed to people with disabilities, if that makes sense. Because is there any school of thought that actually I do live with a disability versus society is disabling me? I just wondered whether that can ever be isolating in language.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because the answer is that if you've not been exposed to the social model, you can, and you do get people who say, well, actually, I'm disabled, but well, I have a disability, but that disability doesn't define me. Therefore, I'm much more comfortable with someone with a disability. To be honest, when I first I was going to say when I first heard social model, but I think the problem was I didn't. When I first had someone tell me I ought to be calling myself a disabled person, not a person with disability, my immediate reaction was very much kind of, well, who the fuck do you think you are to tell me what I call myself? And I think that's really important. I think it's worth saying that organisationally, we never, ever tell people how to describe themselves. There's something where, I've been in meetings where people start doing it, and I really wish they wouldn't. I've had people say to people, you shouldn't be saying you're a person with a disability. That's not and it's not. Ultimately, yeah, you do get some people who don't like the term disabled person. And I think, generally speaking, when you're using kind of neutral language on your website or wherever else, then if you use either disabled people or people with disabilities, it's very rare anyone will react to either of those things. But I think that the issue is that sometimes people will, and I think then it's just really important to be able to understand where they're coming from, and and understand their perspective, so that you can respond to it. So it's very rare, but it happens, that someone says, well, hang on a second, you're saying people with disabilities on your website, but I'm disabled. But I have genuinely had a situation where someone's come up to me at an event and said, Attitudes Everything working with this organization used people with disabilities, you shouldn't be working with them. And this was a disability-led organization that were using it. So you will occasionally get people who feel, because language is a very key part of people's identity. So, yeah, you will get some people who'd rather you didn't use disabled people, but it's less it's less likely, I think, than with people with disabilities, because there's not a kind of ideological underpinning of it in the same way that there is. But it's worth, whichever language you use, it's worth being aware that sometimes people might come back with questions about that.
Thank you, Paul.
So advice about making, I'm appreciating Steve's point, by the way, about not, I give everyone permission not to make beds every day, but advice about making communication, apparently as well, making beds is really bad in terms of bed bugs. Apparently bed bugs are much more likely to thrive in a made bed than an unmade bed. But, you know, I feel that's really not related to this Empower Hour, is it? Can you give me some advice about making communications, emails, social media and website accessible? Absolutely, Zoe, a huge topic. I think a key thing is providing access information. So it's providing information on your website where you're saying we are welcoming disabled people, this is what we're doing. It's worth thinking about different formats. So, you know, thinking about, are we doing things in different ways? Now, the big issue with web accessibility, smartphones are really good at doing a lot of things. So often smartphones can make text larger on websites, will have a screen reader often built onto them. So a screen reader is when someone's got a visual impairment, it reads information out. But where things can go wrong is if you've got things on your website which are not text. So this could be, obviously this can be, a good example we use in the music industry is festivals. Festivals often put a lineup poster on their website, and that lineup poster will normally be a picture with obviously the name of the band's playing. It's lineup posters, that's what it is. But screen readers will just know there's a picture and not be able to read that. Now you can then do a number of different things. You could have a MP3 recording reading out the lineup. You could have the lineup listed out on a website underneath that. Or what you could also do, and this is a bit complex with a lineup poster, but with images in general, is most website software, and certainly Twitter and Facebook and most social media sites, have got what's called alt text. And when you click on an image, when you set up and upload an image, there'll be an option to include alt text. And alt text basically is what the screen reader describes as an image to be to someone. So it might be, for example, it might say, this is a picture of I'm just looking around my room to try and see something. This is a picture of a yellow mug with a skull on it, you know, for example, and then someone just knows what that image is. They don't feel they're missed out on an image. You can also, with that, so for example, you can mark an image as decorative. That means it won't describe the image, but it will sort of say, you don't need to worry about this image. It's not actually something that's going to, you know, you don't actually need to know what this image is. There's an image here, but you're not missing out on the experience. So I think that's the other thing that you can do. So, you know, I mean, it's a big area, so there's other things, but I think the basics are making sure your website is screen reader compatible, including access information, thinking about different ways of providing information. And there are what's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which you can download and read, or just if you've got a web developer, ask them if your website is WCAG compatible. Got a question from Lemia here. So for those who haven't been exposed to neurodiversity and are not aware of the term neurotypical, how can someone who is explaining different neurotypes and identified neurodivergent respond to those who get offended by the label or dismiss terminologies as bad labels? Ultimately, how can neurotypical become more comfortable with the term without invalidating the experiences of neurodivergent people? I mean, that's a big area, and I think one of the problems is we live in a time where there's a bit of a backlash to equality, where people get, I mean, to give an example, there was recently a podcast published of the comedian David Baddiel speaking to the footballer Jason Lee about the way that David Baddiel mocked Jason Lee in the 1990s in a way which now would be construed as racist, wasn't at the time. And David Baddiel was interviewing, you know, speaking to Jason Lee and apologizing for it. And, you know, and I saw a social media thing about that, where immediately someone felt the need to kind of find every single situation they could think of where a person of color had said something vaguely offensive about a white person, try and say, well, look, other people can be racist as well. It's not, you know, why they were, you know, and there seems to be this need from some people to immediately say, well, hang on, you're saying I'm neurotypical. What's wrong with me being neurotypical? And I think that's unfortunate and that's difficult. I think in terms of what you practically do about it, I think all you can do is sort of try to calmly explain and say, you know, it's just that some people experience the world in different ways. And you know, maybe you feel everyone feels this is the world, you know, and I think as well, it's sometimes about understanding that you can't win every single argument, and sometimes it's about thinking, who is this actually someone who's a major ability to influence an organization, in which case we really need to do some more work on how we can influence this. Is this someone actually who's got someone more senior we can have a chat with, not to call that person out, but just to say, can we do some unlearning across that organization? Can we actually do a bit of learning around your organization? Or is this just someone that is this just someone who's, you know, who actually you can kind of walk away from ultimately and not be part of your life again? Because the problem is that you sometimes, you know, it's like I remember being at a festival when one of my colleagues started asking me questions about why they disabled toilets as well, at all, because shouldn't everyone all be able to use the same toilet? You know, and obviously theoretically, yeah, that'd be brilliant if there were all toilets were accessible, but in a festival environment where there's only kind of 7 accessible toilets across the site and kind of loads of other toilets, and accessible toilets get full quicker than non-accessible toilets, and you may or may not know that wheelchair users have to put their hands on the seat of a toilet to get onto a toilet. You know, essentially you do need to limit those accessible toilets, and sometimes, like I say, sometimes you just get people that you're not going to win an argument with. Interesting thing with Steve Varden. So yeah, so in the 90s, people with disabilities were considered to be more PC than disabled people. It's interesting from reversed. Yeah, and this is really important. Language changes and how people think. And in the 90s, there was this onus on actually, we need to think about people as people. We need to say, actually, this is a person with this condition, but they're a person. Whereas now we live in a time where there's a lot more pride taken in individual identities, but also a sense of actually an understanding that where we tried to get to in the 80s and 90s with equality made some progress, but didn't take into account equity, and the fact that not everyone, you know, making everything equal doesn't actually give everyone an equitable experience. And there's a cartoon you might have seen where you've got 3 people trying to see over a fence, and you know, one of them stand, you know, and then there's the idea of giving everyone a box so everyone can see over the fence, but actually some people can see over the fence anyway, so don't need that box. I'm explaining this cartoon so badly, but you know, but essentially the point is that making things equitable sometimes means not just saying, well, we're all people, and you know, we've all got our different needs and we can all kind of come together and sing Kumbaya, but saying actually sometimes people need different things at different times, you know?
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Mandy.
Thank you. Really interesting. I've got a few questions, please. Firstly, I'm 3 days into my new role here, Inclusion Development Manager here. One of the first things I want to look at is our recruitment process, you know, how accessible is that? So back to the terminology, you know, people with disabilities, disabled people, what would be one of the main sort of terminology we'd use to ask people if they want to disclose a disability or information share? Because I want to be able to use that information just to support people, make it more inclusive, make the process a lot easier, application process a lot easier for people to apply to, and, you know, really make it more inclusive. So would it be something along the lines of, would you consider yourself to have a disability? What would you suggest terminology-wise?
There's 2 ways of doing it, I'd say. One, if you want to go for the shorter sentence, I'd say, do you consider yourself to be disabled under the 2010 Equality Act? Just because then it's not saying you're thinking anything about yourself, you're just thinking about, do you? The other way you can do it, I mean, the way we do it when we're kind of being a bit more detailed in how we describe who we reach is, like I say, our short-term disabled people. Our longer term is it's something like people who consider themselves to be deaf, disabled, neurodivergent or have a long-term physical or mental health condition. And it's a bit of a mouthful, that, but then it does sort of take into account the fact that people might think about themselves in different ways, and people might sort of say, well, actually, I've got a long-term health condition, so that applies to me, but wouldn't say they were disabled.
That's it. I don't want it to be a barrier to them.
Exactly. Yeah.
I want to flip it around the other way and want people to apply. So that's really helpful. Thank you very much. Just to mention, when you said before, I actually 3 days in, trying to reach the printer yesterday, and I can't see the top of the printer. I can't reach it, so I have to go on tiptoe and get a step. So, and last question is, how do we find out more information about the 3-hour session, please?
Okay. Yeah. So the easiest way really is to drop me an email. There is an email I ought to give you, which is either email me or email info@attitudeseverything.org.uk. I'll stick that in I'll stick it in the chat now.
Thank you. Thanks.
I can email stuff around as well to everyone.
Thanks,
and then we can give you details about that. One more question from Lemia here, which is it accessible for employers to ask, what is the effect of your disability or health condition, your ability to give your best at work? Please write in here at their recruitment equality monitoring form. I mean, I suppose the answer to that is a monitoring form should be anonymous. So it's probably not helpful for them to ask that. I think there's risks. I'd worry about answering that question personally, in the sense that you obviously want to, it's important that organizations have a constructive conversation about accessibility, but I think it's also important to do it because I think it's to give your best at work as well is slightly, it makes me slightly nervous. But I think that, there's ways of saying, do you have an access requirement? And other ways we can support you in the workplace. But I think that way that question's phrased there immediately sort of implies that it's going to be a negative impact. You're not going to give your best at work. And it sort of feels like, and the other thing as well is that it's really important when doing recruitment to be careful about where you ask about access requirements, in the sense that, the best way to do it is to get the monitoring information and sort of do monitor and not make sure that's anonymous, to then ask people about access requirements at interview, and then ask people about access requirements when they start. You might want, if you're a disability confident employer, you might want to, you might have a scheme where you offer anyone an interview if they meet the essential criteria, and then you might want to explain that and then just quickly ask, do you want to be considered under that? But the problem is, if you start asking about access requirements too early, then people can perceive that that's going to have a material impact on whether they're shortlisted, a material impact on whether they're recruited. And obviously, even if it doesn't, it might cause some suspicion. Or it might, on the other hand, mean that people are more likely not to disclose things. Whereas, if someone's asked about access requirements once you've offered someone a job and they know that they've got that job offer, then it's easier to actually say, well, this is what I need, because you don't then think, well, they can easily then turn around and say, we've gone with another candidate,
Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks everyone for being so engaged with this. It was brilliant, so much information in an hour. So thank you again so much. I put some links in for a follow-up session that's happening next year with Phoebe, a fellow Phoebe from Attitude is Everything. And I will email around any of Paul's resources, presentation, information about your 3-hour session, and a survey as well. But thanks so much for spending your lunchtime with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.